You wake to the sound of steel. The rhythm is steady, practiced the whisper of a blade sliding across wet stone. Somewhere beyond your chamber door, a man tests the edge that will soon pass through your neck. The air is damp and smells of river mist and candle smoke, as if London itself is holding its breath. Before we begin this descent into Anne Boleyn's final morning, take a moment to breathe with history. If stories like this remind you that the past still trembles beneath our feet, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's almost haunting to think that from Lahore to Lisbon, from Manila to Manchester, we're all gathered here centuries later to witness the same dawn at the Tower of London. Outside, carpenters hammer together the platform where the Queen of England will die. Each thud of their mallets reverberates through the tower's walls, echoing like a slow drumbeat. The scaffold stands near the Queen's house, a few paces from the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where her body will soon be laid. The wood is fresh cut and pale, not yet darkened by weather or blood. Anne kneels before the crucifix. Her lips move soundlessly. She has requested the sacrament and confessed her sins to Bishop John Skipp. Those who see her note her composure too calm. Some think, for a woman condemned. She wears a gown of dark gray damask over a crimson kirtle, the colors of mourning and martyrdom. Her hood is French, her hair neatly bound. When Kingston, the constable of the tower, enters to tell her the executioner is ready, she smiles faintly and says, "I hear he is very skillful, and I have but a little neck." Then, touching her throat, she laughs softly, almost tenderly. It is a laugh that startles even Kingston. It does not sound like fear, but recognition, as if she already sees the script of her own death. At the king's command, a swordsman has been summoned from Calais. Henry has promised his former queen a cleaner death, not by the heavy English axe that often took 2, even 3 strokes, but by the swiftness of a French blade. The gesture has been described as mercy. But mercy, in Henry's hands, is never simple. Perhaps he wishes to appear magnanimous. Perhaps he wishes the execution to be a spectacle of grace rather than gore. Or perhaps he wishes to show the world that even in death, Anne is his staged, costumed, and choreographed to the end. As the morning brightens, the city begins to stir. A few hundred spectators gather quietly at the Tower Green courtiers, officials, and those fortunate enough to receive the rare permission to attend. The crowd is hushed, tense. They have seen men die for the king's pleasure before, but never a queen. Never the woman who once held Henry's heart and turned kingdoms against Rome. The bell of St. Peter's tolls 9 times. The sound ripples across the river, through fog and gulls, and settles into the bones of every witness. Anne steps out from her chamber, escorted by Kingston and her ladies. Her face is pale but unflinching. She carries herself with the same grace that once captivated Europe. Observers later recall that she seemed to be nothing less than a queen, even in death. The wind lifts the hem of her gown as she walks slow, measured steps toward the scaffold. Upon the platform, she kneels. Her eyes sweep the gathered faces. Soldiers, nobles, scribes, and a handful of women who cannot look away. She asks the constable, "May I speak?" Kingston nods. Her voice, when it comes, is clear and steady. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to the law. I do not accuse any man, nor do I speak against the king. He hath been ever a good, gentle, and sovereign lord." Her words, preserved by witnesses, are carefully chosen. They are not the words of defiance, but of survival beyond death. She knows that to die with grace is the only weapon left to her. She ends with a prayer, "Jesu, receive my soul. Lord, have mercy on me," and removes her hood herself. Her ladies, trembling, step forward to bind her eyes with a linen cloth. One is said to faint, another cannot stop weeping. The executioner steps forward, tall, foreign, dressed in black. He kneels before her, as was the custom, and says softly, "Madame, your grace, forgive me this duty." Anne's answer is almost inaudible. "Willingly." He signals to his assistant. "Bring me my sword," he calls, but the blade is already hidden in the straw behind him. The ruse distracts her just enough. In one practiced motion, the Frenchman swings. There is no cry, no hesitation. A single sound cuts the morning air, the whisper of steel. Then silence. For a moment, no one moves. Then, as if released from a spell, the crowd exhales. Anne Boleyn's head, still veiled, is lifted and placed within a small straw-lined chest. Her body follows. Both are carried to the chapel and buried within the tower's stones, no monument, no royal mourning. By noon, the scaffold is empty. The sword is wiped clean. The witnesses disperse into the city, and somewhere, perhaps at Wolf Hall, Jane Seymour is told that the king has ridden out to her. The dawn that began with the sharpening of steel ends in silence, the kind that only follows when a kingdom has erased its queen. But the air over the tower holds something heavier than smoke, something no sword can sever, the echo of a voice that would not be buried, the ghost of a woman who died watching history rewrite her name. The sound of the blade still lingers. It did not begin with a sword. It began with a letter. In April 1536, while the Queen of England smiled through the last flickers of her reign, Thomas Cromwell sat alone in his chambers, surrounded by parchment. The wax on the seals still glistened. The ink was barely dry. Outside, the spring rain drummed against the leaded windows of Austin Friars, and the candles trembled in their sconces. There, amid the smell of vellum and smoke, the quiet architect of destruction began to write. Anne Boleyn had become dangerous not because she had sinned, but because she had failed. She had given the king a daughter instead of a son, and the promise of reform had curdled into rebellion. Cromwell, once her ally, now served a different master, Henry's wounded pride. What Henry wanted, Cromwell would make lawful. What Henry desired, Cromwell would make true on paper at least. He began with names: court musicians, gentlemen, a poet, a brother, each one tied to the queen by laughter, by dance, by rumor. The air of the Tudor court was thick with glances and whispers, and Cromwell knew how to turn whispers into weapons. He called his scribes close. "Write what must be written," he said. "Truth will follow ink." The conspiracy took shape not as a single accusation, but as a web, delicate, deliberate. Each thread could stand alone, but together they formed something that looked like inevitability. Dates were shifted. Meetings were reimagined. Confessions were extracted with quiet brutality. Under interrogation, Mark Smeaton, the court musician who once played for the Queen's supper, broke first. We do not know exactly what was said in that dark room. The records speak only in the careful language of the state. He confessed freely. But witnesses later whispered that Smeaton was kept without sleep, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. When asked if he had been the Queen's lover, he hesitated, and that hesitation was all Cromwell needed. The ink followed. Anne's brother, George Boleyn, was next. Brilliant, witty, dangerous in his loyalty. The accusations against him bordered on madness: incest with the Queen, treason in thought and speech. But once the Crown demanded guilt, guilt appeared. At Westminster, the machinery of rumor turned to law. Cromwell drafted the articles of indictment with surgical precision 33 charges of adultery, conspiracy, and high treason. The language was cold and deliberate, the tone almost reverent. To the untrained eye, it read as justice. To those who looked closer, it read as theater. And yet, in the margins of those documents, one can almost feel Cromwell's hand, the hesitation between words, the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood that power does not lie in the blade, but in the story the blade requires. The king, meanwhile, played his own part. He withdrew to Greenwich, cloaking himself in grief. "She has betrayed me," Henry is said to have told his courtiers. "With men of low birth, as though I were unworthy of her love." But even as he spoke those words, he had already begun to court Jane Seymour, the quiet shadow waiting to replace the fallen queen. What was Anne doing while her ruin was being written? She was attending Mass, smiling in the garden, writing letters to her husband, unaware that her words were already being twisted against her. "I have been your loyal wife," she wrote, "and God knows I never thought to offend you in heart or deed." It was a plea written in devotion, but read by men who had already sealed her fate. By the end of April, London was humming with the news. The Queen would be tried for adultery. The Tower gates were prepared. The court, once her stage, turned its eyes away. On May 2nd, Anne was summoned to appear before the King's Council. The journey from Greenwich to the Tower was short, but it was enough to change the course of English history. Eyewitnesses said she carried herself with a strange calm, as though she had not yet grasped the shape of the accusation. When informed of the charges, she laughed sharp and disbelieving. "I am accused of misusing myself with my brother," she asked. "If they think me so, then I see what is meant." That night, the Tower's iron gate swallowed her whole. The same fortress that had once welcomed her as queen now received her as prisoner. In Cromwell's study, the papers lay stacked and sealed, ready for the judges. He paused over the final document, the articles of high treason, and dipped his quill once more. The ink bled across the parchment like a spreading bruise. History remembers Cromwell as the master of reform, the hammer of monasteries, the man who broke England from Rome. But on these pages, he was something else. A playwright of ruin, composing a tragedy in which every line was rehearsed, every witness chosen, every signature preordained. Outside, London slept uneasily. The Thames moved slow and black under the moonlight, carrying whispers between palaces and prisons. Somewhere beyond the Tower walls, the executioner from Calais was already on the road. By the time the sword reached London, the trial was over. The verdict had been written before the jury sat. Words had done their work, and as the ink dried, Anne Boleyn, still alive, still praying in the gray light of dawn, became a ghost long before the blade ever touched her neck. The blade falls. The crowd exhales. The Queen is gone. But death, for Anne Boleyn, is not an ending, it is an echo. In the weeks after her execution, the Tower returns to its old rhythm of footsteps, oaths, and silence. The wooden scaffold is dismantled, its planks reused. The straw is burned. The French swordsman departs quietly with his payment, the price of royal blood, £30 in gold. And yet, something remains. The servants whisper of footsteps near the chapel at night, of a woman's voice praying in the dark. Anne's name, though forbidden at court, begins to bloom in secret. In one letter preserved from that summer, a lady writes, "She is gone, yet her eyes still trouble us." Henry VIII wastes no time rewriting the story. Within 11 days, he marries Jane Seymour, the pale English rose who will give him the son he has long desired. In sermons and proclamations, Anne is transformed into something monstrous, a warning to ambitious women, a parable of lust disguised as faith. She is blamed for dividing the church, seducing the king, and defying God's order. The English court learns to speak of her only in whispers or in contempt. But outside the palace walls, her legend takes root in darker soil. Protestant reformers, scattered across Europe, begin to write of Anne as a martyr, a queen who died for conscience and truth. They pass her story hand to hand, shaping it into a tale of divine justice. In one Geneva tract she appears as the noble lady, whom the Lord did choose to open the eyes of a blinded realm. The heretic becomes a saint. The condemned woman becomes the mother of reformation. Decades pass. England's crown changes heads and faiths. And then, from the very daughter she bore in disgrace, the empire remakes itself. Elizabeth ascends the throne in 1558. Anne's child, grown into the image of command. Pale, Flame-haired and fierce, Elizabeth never speaks of her mother in public. But those closest to her note that she wears a small ring, set with a hidden portrait of Anne, a face within a face. The daughter's silence becomes the loudest act of remembrance. Under Elizabeth's reign, Anne's ghost is not exorcised but exalted. Poets and painters resurrect her beauty. Scholars record her virtues. The same courtiers who once spat her name now praise her lineage. The concubine becomes the blessed mother of England's golden age. It is as if the axe has been buried not in her neck but in the truth itself, carving her into whatever shape the age requires. Still, not everyone believes the saint's version. Catholic exiles across the Channel continue to write of Anne as the serpent who tempted Henry from Rome. In their eyes, she is no victim, no visionary, only the eve of England's fall. The same woman becomes both holy and damned, depending on who holds the pen. Her story continues to shift with the centuries. In the reign of James I, she is a ghost of ambition. In the Victorian age, she becomes romance, a doomed lover betrayed by her king. The Tudors fade, but Anne remains, her memory changing shape like wax before a flame. And yet, beneath all these reinventions, one question refuses to fade. Was she guilty or merely inconvenient? The historians return to the records, to the brittle parchments where Cromwell's ink still stains the page. They find contradictions, impossible dates, confessions signed under duress. They find letters from Anne's ladies, who insist she died innocent. And they find the words Anne herself spoke on the scaffold. "I pray God save the king, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince there never was." Was it irony, forgiveness, or the final weapon of a woman who knew her death would outlive his mercy? In the dim archives of the British Library, her handwriting still dances across the page, small, delicate, and defiant. Each loop and flourish seems to whisper, "I am still here." Centuries later, tourists walk the Tower Green. They take photographs where she once knelt. The grass hides the blood, but not the memory. The wind that moves through the chapel windows still smells faintly of salt and iron. Guides tell the story of the queen who laughed before she died. Children stare at the spot where history turned human. Every age finds its own Anne Boleyn, the heretic, the victim, the lover, the witch, the saint. But perhaps the truest version is the one that cannot be named the woman who looked into the mirror of power and saw both her reflection and her doom. For when the blade fell, England did not just kill its queen, it gave birth to its most enduring ghost.